Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Implementing a Hybrid Cloud Solution in Government, sponsored by VMware on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today, Howard Spira, the Chief Information Officer at the Export and Import Bank of the United States, Ben Bergerson, the CIO of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and Bill Rowan, the Vice President of Federal Sales for VMware. Toward the end of the last segment, we got into a deeper conversation about cybersecurity. And Bill, I know you wanted to jump in before we ran out of time, so I'm going to kick it back to you. Based on what you heard from Howard, based on what you heard from Ben, cybersecurity cloud, give me a sense of what you're seeing, what you're hearing.
Well, I think it's, so if we can work under the assumption that cybersecurity is now the most overused word, it's overtaken cloud significantly.
Not AI?
Not AI
Not
yet.
machine
It's still
okay.
in the waiting number 2 position. But I do think, though, it's giving us an interesting opportunity to look at organizations and look at how we're actually doing security. So if we've moved from this predominant client-server type environment to where I'm getting many more of my applications as a service, it's giving me an opportunity to relook at my infrastructure and say, is there a different way of doing things, especially at the endpoint? So you see clients starting to talk about, well, I'm going to move more towards a virtual desktop environment because the vast majority of the applications I'm getting are coming over the network. I don't need a big honking desktop to be able to support those applications the way I may have needed to for, say, an older version of Exchange than it is today. So that's one dynamic. The second dynamic is that it's giving me an opportunity to look at different implementation strategies around segmenting my applications. And at VMware, we talk about micro-segmentation, but specifically, I can look at my traffic now and say, well, everything's coming in via the network for those SaaS-based applications, but if a lot of my traffic is east-west now internally, I can now, in a very agile manner, create a software-defined network across both my layer 2 and layer 3, but I can also extend that across the wide area network. As these moves towards the cloud are freeing up some of that expertise inside of an organization to say, I can now create incremental defenses against cybersecurity with the resources I have that'll even better protect me as I'm using these services from the cloud. And I think that's one of those advantages that we are starting to see come more and more to the marketplace that will be more cost efficient than saying going out and investing in an MPLS backbone or whatever I might have done in the past.
Bill, we wanted to follow up with you on one thing, because as you were kind of going through the changes that are happening across the government and the apps as a service, and I'll bring it up. I mean, we know that agencies are going to be in a hybrid cloud environment for quite a while. I mean, whether, as Howard was saying, 60% of your stuff's in the cloud, 40% is not yet, but that 40% will never be 0. It may be 20, maybe 10, maybe 5, but you always have something in-house. Does that change the security look too? Because maybe that stuff that's in-house needs even more security, and then we can add identity management to that in a different way than maybe something that you put in the cloud, like a website that anyone can access. I mean, what's that thought process that you're seeing?
I think Ben brought the point up earlier. We're getting a chance to learn from organizations that, in most part, can invest X numbers of factors of more money into cybersecurity than maybe an agency or big or small can. It's just the economics of the overall. So we're learning from those processes. We do get a chance to continue to look at new ways of doing things. It's a smaller piece of infrastructure I'm having to rely or manage, so therefore operationally I can keep better set of eyes on it. And I also think that as we see more and more information being shared about the risk, whether they are state actors, whether these are some kid in a coffee shop someplace who is just trying to be cool and thinks he can hack an agency or an organization, we're getting much better at the defense. But make no mistake about it, the stuff that we are really worried about will be a threat there for quite some time in the future, long after those of us on this panel are probably out of this business, but it's going to continue to be an issue. And if we don't continue to apply rigor and technology to the extent we can, we're going to just be giving up the keys to the kingdom.
I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball to both Howard and Ben here. So here we go. Pay attention, Bryce Harper. SDN, thin clients, two things that Bill mentioned that are big in the larger agencies. Has that kind of come down to the smaller agencies? Are either of you looking at SDN or thin clients? Separately or together?
One very good surprise that we had when we migrated to a new cloud provider, they had that implemented in their network.
I'm sorry, which one, thin or SDN?
SDN.
Okay.
Yeah, not thin. And so we moved one of our applications into the cloud, and we did it so smoothly that nobody noticed. And I had to go back and tell people, by the way, we moved over the weekend. Did you notice anything? They said, oh, you did? Yeah, it's faster. So that's a nice side benefit. So the fact that there are large cloud providers and they have things moved, as Bill said, to the edge of the network and on the east and west, and they've worked out load balancing so that it is faster. So that's kind of cool.
All right. Howard?
I was going to say on the desktops, we're looking very seriously at that. We think we're probably going to start with, to the extent that we have any development left in-house, we do have a bit of that, but we think those are prime candidates for it. It wouldn't surprise me, actually, if we analyzed our desktops to a large extent. They're being used in a thin client mode.
Anyways.
Yeah.
Without it, I mean, do it.
And at least that's what our monitoring is showing us more and more. So I think we see a lot of advantages of that, but I also think it's a process that for us, we're, I think, looking at as sort of a state of the market evolution. We don't need to be there's nothing so pressing with respect to our economics and the challenges a small agency has, which actually tends to be less of a challenge because we're not managing that many endpoints. So these are problems that when they scale, they tend to have complexity that squares. So we're operating in, I'll call it, a simpler part of the curve. But I'd certainly like to get there. It's just a heck of a lot easier to manage.
Yeah. And Bill, from your perspective, when you work with large agencies, when I speak with CIOs, I find that there's a lot of talk about SDN, a lot of interest in it, and a lot of interest in moving to a thinner zero client because of what they can do in the cloud. Are you finding that conversation's coming up as well?
Absolutely. I don't think, today, if a customer is discussing how they're going to take advantage as they've moved more and more of these applications to the cloud, how does that impact their workforce at the desktop layer? And I would say that for the most part, it becomes a two-part conversation. Is this going to be a cheaper, easier to manage type environment for me? And then secondly, how does this fit into my mobility strategy for my agency? Those pieces tend to go hand in hand. As it comes to the network, as it's interesting, as more and more of these applications have moved to the cloud, the network infrastructure that an agency put in place and the way that was architected, there's a lot of it freed up resource within that network. Now, I may have put more of a load on my main switch, but the rest of my the organization and the hierarchy may not be being used as heavily as it was before. That's giving me a chance to repurpose those assets to support different types of applications. So it's just creating a discussion of is there, as we look to repurpose these assets or potentially excess those assets, that is going to save me on my O&M tail, is there a different way to approach it? And that's really where this conversation is coming up for the most part.
Howard?
So I think this is one area that small agencies are actually like pretty different from big agencies, which is the ratio of sort of the actual, I'll call it, hardware cost to the thinking cost or the engineering cost. And in big agencies, you've typically got large, I'll call it hardware or endpoint deployed software cost relative to the amount of engineering time. So in a small agency, because we've got that really small footprint, the thing that I tend to really focus on is my scarce resource is not the budget for endpoints, right? It's my network engineer, it's my senior network engineers, and how much time I can get from them. So I think it's just kind of interesting to see the difference between big agency perspective and small agency perspective, and sort of the different kinds of costs and where they've got scale and where they don't.
the cost issues is fascinating because I think this leads us down the path of as you guys are looking at moving to the cloud and doing IT modernization, whether it's SDN or thin client or whatever virtualization you're going to go down the path, you're going to use contractor. And I think, Howard, you brought up the fact that your ratio is probably 2.5, maybe 3 to 1 contractor to Fed. I imagine, Ben, your ratio of contractors to Fed is probably similar.
More contractors.
Yeah.
We're a very small agency.
Right. So talk maybe a little about that engagement as we move to the cloud. As you modernize your IT, does that engagement with those contractors change? Does the relationship change much? And Ben, start us off.
We do things differently when we're buying cloud services, and we have to think about them differently. Since we had our financial systems in the cloud 5, 6, 7 years ago, and then we're adding more and more and finding that we're moving from one cloud provider to another, or we're expanding one areas of service. So we need to create flexible contracts. And the Department of Defense and DISA created clauses that go into all cloud contracts for entrance, migration, and exit, saying that you're going to get full cooperation and assistance to move from this provider to that provider as your agency needs change, and you might move back again, and you might move a piece back in-house or move it back. So we're actually experiencing the flexibility, and you want to think through that ahead of time when you write your contract. So that is new, how we're talking to contractors, as well as something that Howard mentioned of if you are working with large shared service and cloud providers, they have hundreds of staff and engineers, and they can leapfrog your ability when you have a smaller staff. So we want to take advantage of the different companies, and they might have 100 security engineers, and they have the newest threat intelligence, and they are stopping the latest virus that came out today, where we don't have that hundreds of staff to do that.
Bill, jump in a little bit and talk about the engagements. Do you present differently to Ben and Howard than you would to a CIO at VA or HHS?
Well, I think the engagement is very, very similar. It has to be because we're talking about a scale issue and not a different set of problems in many respects. What is interesting has probably been that when we do executive briefings for our clients, one of the most requested things we have come up is asking to speak to our CIO at a corporate level and say, how has your business changed? Today inside of VMware, if I look at a field organization, 80 some applications we use are all as a service. We're not hosting them, they're being hosted someplace else and being presented to us. And so the question then goes to our CIO of how have you changed your organization? What do you see those changes in the next 3 to 5 years if that continues? And I think that has become the most interesting dialogue. I think customers are so much more clear and have a good vision of the ones and zeros part of the equation. They're looking for the discussion of, talk to me about the re-engineering of resources over a period of time, and what the type of contractor I should be writing an RFP for today for a service or that I will use 12 to 24 months from now, as opposed to having a contract that it was meant to help keep the lights on, support the application. That's a shift. And as Howard rightly talked about, I've moved 60%, in his situation, moved about 60% to the cloud. My footprint of 40% is going to continue to shrink. How does that impact the types of workers that I'm going to contract for? And what does that skill need to look like in a couple years so I can be ensuring I'm getting the best return on the investment?
Howard, jump into as you guys as you're working with contractors and you're moving it forward. What's that engagement like? What has to change on your end, or what has to change on their end?
Sure. Well, I think some of the ideas were mentioned, but I want to come back to scale a little bit because I think this is another sort of interesting cleavage point between big agencies and little. So, for example, we have Office 365 in the cloud, but as you know, to provide Office 365, there's actually a tapestry of services. So the Office 365 piece is actually just one piece of the equation, and you still have to manage your accounts and setting up people and onboarding and onboarding, offboarding, et cetera. So the way we handle that in a small agency is we have a general infrastructure management contract, and that as part of their contract for managing the general infrastructure, they also manage the interaction with our, as a service, our Office 365 provider, versus sometimes in a big agency, they will actually have complete contracts around each as a service. So I think when small agencies may have a different sort of tapestry of contracts that they're stitching together to provide the end-to-end service, that's a different tapestry that a big agency will come at it as. And so where I see is trying to understand that tapestry and then saying, for the end-to-end service, right, what are all the contracts that actually are impacted, and then am I ensuring, like I said, in that infrastructure contract, that general infrastructure contract, it's like, okay, well, you've got to be cloud savvy, you've got to be cloud knowledgeable, and if you're not today, in certain areas, we're going to keep moving stuff. So in your out years, you need to be able to bring this skill in. So that's, to me, one of the biggest challenges is we're typically at a scale where we have to, we're not going to put a single, I'll call it end-to-end contract around a single service, and we're stitching together a service contract typically with a sort of a cloud SaaS or PaaS or even an IaaS contract, and how do we marry the service concept with the, I'll call it sort of the iron concept.
All right, unfortunately though, we're out of time. That was a great conversation, and I think we could talk a little bit longer, but we're gonna say thank you very much to our guests, Howard Spira, the Chief Information Officer at the Export-Import Bank of the United States, Ben Bergerson, the CIO of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and Bill Rowan, the Vice President for Federal Sales for VMware. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I'm Jason Miller, I've been your host, and you've been listening to the panel discussion, Implementing a Hybrid Cloud Solution in Government, sponsored by VMware on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.
On behalf of VMware, thank you for joining us. The archive session will be available shortly. If you qualify for continuing education credit, you'll also receive an email with your training certification. This concludes our discussions, and thank you.